Hello, everyone. I'm Deb Markowitz, the State Director for the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts. Thank you for joining us for today's Nature Connects webinar. The Massachusetts chapter of the Nature Conservancy is hosting these webinars to connect you with scientists, experts, and influencers from New England and around the world. Today, we're joined by Dr. David Wattles from the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. But before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the horrible acts of violence that occurred yesterday in our nation's capital. I don't think any of us believed that such an attack on our capital, our Constitution, and our country was possible. And I know you'd agree it was just horrifying to watch. I'm a former Secretary of State, and I have to say, I know firsthand the importance of protecting our institutions of democracy to ensure a peaceful transition of power. And I also know that a functioning and robust democracy is essential if we're going to justly address the big issues facing our society, the pandemic, economic recovery, combating the climate crisis. And, of course, a fundamental part of any robust democracy is the right to protest. But this is the right of the people peaceably to assemble. This violent attempt to disrupt and prevent the democratic transfer of power is unpatriotic and criminal. We cannot achieve our mission of achieving a world where people and nature thrive if the very foundation of our democracy is under attack. We condemn the attacks that occurred, and our thoughts are with all of our friends, families, and colleagues, and the people who represent us, our public servants in Washington. Now, I'm going to turn it over to our host today, Andy Finton. He's the Forest Conservation Director for the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Deb. And hello, everyone. It's great to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. I find Dave Wattles' research fascinating. And it's not only fascinating, but his understanding of moose and bear habitat, their movement patterns, the impacts of climate change, the impacts of roads, is critical for our understanding of how to conserve the landscapes they depend on. Before I hand it over to Dave, I'm going to quickly give you a snapshot, a little taste of the Nature Conservancy's efforts to map and protect these large intact forested landscapes that define New England. They sustain moose and bear, and they sustain us as well. Give me 1 second to load some slides. And I'll just start with saying that living just outside of Boston as I do, I find that even I, whose job it is to protect these large forested landscapes, sometimes takes for granted the fact that they're out there and doing all the things that we depend on them for. New England has 32 million acres of forest, and Massachusetts has 3 million of those acres. And we are so critically dependent on this forested landscape. As many people know, the 100,000 acres of protected forest around the Quabbin Reservoir in central Massachusetts filters the drinking water for 3 million people in and around Boston. These same forested landscapes absorb carbon emissions, helping us fight climate change. And I think we're all very aware that the forests that surround us are critical for our own health and well-being, for our recreation and renewal. And it's actually been shown that in these challenging times, nature literally has the power to heal us. The challenge is that in New England, we lose 24,000 acres of forest every year, 6,000 of those in Massachusetts alone every year. And I've dedicated my 23 years at the Nature Conservancy to protecting these forested landscapes. And as a tool to accelerate those efforts, the Nature Conservancy recently completed a nationwide analysis of climate resilient landscapes. And on this map, the green areas are those places that will support plants and animals in a changing climate. Dave is going to go deeper into this concept, but these places have something we call microclimates or microhabitats, places that allow plants and animals to find suitable habitat to be able to thrive under extreme climate conditions, droughts, heat waves, floods, and extreme storms, supporting everything from moose and bear to butterflies and maple trees. just this past week, the Boston Globe ran a op-ed authored by my colleague, Mark Anderson, who authored and developed this science that we're looking at on this map. And the op-ed does a great job of laying out the science and making a compelling case for conserving these resilient landscapes across the US and the Eastern US. If we zoom into New England, we see, again, in the green areas, a network of these connected and resilient landscapes stretching from Canada down through New England, further south, that support the movement of species in the context of climate change and provide these resilient habitats. These areas also happen to align with the areas that support and store the most carbon right now in our forests. The dark red areas and the lighter orange areas are high density, above ground forest carbon. So conserving these resilient landscapes also mitigates climate change. And more locally, the Nature Conservancy worked with Dave's agency, MassWildlife, to develop Biomap 2, defining conservation priorities in Massachusetts, which is widely used by the land and water conservation community, including municipalities, state agencies, and the land trust community. And at the Conservancy, we're taking action to conserve these landscapes at scale by protecting critical parcels of land, by working with policymakers and decision makers to secure public funding and support, and by sharing our science to help the conservation community define ecological priorities. So I'm excited to hear Dave. I know you guys are too, and I'm going to hand it over to him with just a couple final thoughts. Our modeling and mapping that you've just seen is informed by on-the-ground data, and Dave's research is a critical piece of that understanding of how wildlife uses and moves through the landscape. Dave's research grounds our 30,000-foot perspective with boots on the ground, refining, corroborating, and supporting our conservation strategies. And I'll close by saying that we can't afford to lose and fragment our resilient landscape any further. We can't afford to take them for granted, not if we want them to do all the things we rely on. We need to actively protect these places, and the next decade will be critical for these efforts. So with that, I'm going to give Dave a chance to load his presentation as I introduce Dave. So I met Dave a few years ago, and again, I've been enamored with his work ever since then. And Dr. Dave Wattles has been the bear and fur bearer biologist at MassWildlife since 2016. He earned his PhD from UMass Amherst, where he studied moose habitat, movements, road interactions, and thermal stress. And Dave has also worked with black bear for over 10 years and has researched bear movements, road interaction, and landscape connectivity, along with survival, reproduction, and habitat use. Dave is going to spend just about 30 minutes describing the results of his work, and then we want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions. So you'll notice at the bottom of the Zoom screen a Q&A section. Please, as you think of them, please share your questions in that Q&A box, and we'll circle back to them when Dave is done presenting. Dave, thanks so much for joining us today, and take it away.
Thanks, Andy. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for having me. As Andy mentioned, I'm going to talk primarily about the research that I did as a graduate student on moose here in Massachusetts, and really looking at two aspects of the research: the impacts of thermal stress on moose in southern New England and the potential future impacts of climate change related to that, as well as their road interactions and how the road network affects moose movements, and connectivity and linking the landscape and landscape conservation. This research was primarily funded by MassWildlife through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Program. However, in recent years, MassDOT has contributed considerably to the landscape connectivity and road interaction work associated with both the moose and bear. So this figure depicts the geographic range of moose in North America, and the dotted line outlines that range. You can see that moose are strongly associated with northern latitudes in the boreal and northern forests of North America. If we look at moose range in the Northeast, we are at the extreme southern range of moose geographic range outside of the Rocky Mountains, where elevations provide suitable habitat for moose. Moose were once historically found further south than they are now, as far south as into Pennsylvania in pre-colonial times. But like many of our wildlife species, they were locally extirpated as they were in Massachusetts, or their populations were greatly reduced when most of the forested landscape of the Northeast was cut down and converted into farmland. Additionally, before agencies like MassWildlife and other state wildlife agencies exist, hunting was done in an unregulated fashion. So the combination of habitat loss and hunting led to the declines in those populations. But like many species, as the forested landscape grew, the remaining moose populations in northern New England began to grow. Additionally, once logging was able to occur again in these forests, logging creates fantastic moose habitat that I'll talk about a bit more later. It allowed the populations to grow and expand eventually into New Hampshire, Vermont, and down into Massachusetts, Connecticut, as well as in New York. I'm going to talk briefly about general moose ecology and how climate change and heat stress play into that basic ecology and whether or not moose are likely to survive from one year to the next. Moose are browsers, and so what this means is that they're eating woody vegetation. And if you look at the top of the screen here, that's stems and twigs, it's conifer needles of hemlock and balsam fir here in Massachusetts, even the bark of deciduous shrubs and saplings. And what this means is this is woody vegetation. There's not much nutrition in it, and it's difficult for them to process and digest much in a 24-hour period. The combination of the lack of nutrition and the limits on what they can eat means they're at an energy deficit all winter. The only way that moose can survive in winter is by having enough reserves of fat and muscle that they can draw off of to make it to spring. Because at the bottom, you can see in spring, when leaf out comes, they very quickly switch to green leafy vegetation. And for moose, the main component of their diet is deciduous leaves, so green leaves on shrubs and saplings. And this is where regenerating forests that have resulted from logging or natural shrub communities in places are extremely important for moose. It provides a high density of leafy material at browse height for them. And so it's at this time of year when their diet is very nutritious and they can eat a lot of it, that they're in an energy surplus, and they need to restore those reserves of fat and muscle that are going to allow them to survive the winter. So now if we think about thermal stress, this is something that could potentially affect those reserves. And so in general, any factors that directly increase energy expenditure, decrease their foraging efficiency or time spent foraging, or are direct drains on those reserves are going to reduce the animal's probability of surviving the subsequent winter. At the time that we were starting this work in the mid-2000s, there were a lot of national headlines talking about drastic declines in moose populations along the southern range, particularly in Minnesota at the time, but you've probably seen more recently in northern New England, our moose population is being decimated by the impacts of winter tick. But many of these early studies and the thoughts going into this is that thermal stress, climate change were either driving these declines or contributing factors into the declines of these species. And so that is the context for where we started this work. And so what we wanted to do right off the bat, given our position on the southern edge, where it is obviously warmer than most of the rest of moose range, and species range quite often are limited by things like climate. And so beyond the southern range boundary, it's likely too warm for moose. So we wanted to assess what was the thermal environment in Massachusetts for a moose. And to do this, we looked at the daily maximum temperature and daily minimum temperatures recorded at the Harvard Forest Weather Station in central Massachusetts and compared these to the upper critical temperatures for moose. Upper critical temperatures for any warm-blooded animal are temperatures above which they have to expend excess energy in order to maintain their normal body temperature. So think about your dog panting on a hot sunny day, or you sweating on a hot sunny day. That is your body actually expending energy in order to maintain your lower body temperature. And so if we look at this in summer, and so for moose, those temperatures, these are based on studies of captive moose, the temperatures that they experience thermal stress are quite low in summer, 57 degrees Fahrenheit and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this is where the 57 is where these effects begin. And at 20, they're resorting to thermal panting. But we can see basically the daily maximum temperature throughout the summer is exceeding those thresholds. On these days where the daily minimum temperature exceeds these thresholds, that means the moose aren't in a thermal neutral state or a state where they're not having to expend excess energy at any point in the 24-hour period. And so those captive studies, what's happening here is as we get above temperatures of 14 degrees, we see exponential increases in their metabolic rate. So the heart rate, their metabolic rate, respiration rates, meaning they're directly spending many times as much energy to try to stay cool as they would if temperatures are cooler. As temperatures exceed that 20-degree threshold, this is what happens. This is, you can see the leaves moving here. This is one of our collared moose. It's bedded in the shade. And this was actually a cool day. It was a day a heat wave broke. But look at the moose's nostrils. Look at its hot side here. The nostrils are flaring, its sides heaving. It is way up at the top of those graphs I just showed you in terms of the energy expending. And so this is one of our collared moose responding physiologically exactly the way those captive studies would predict they would based on warm temperatures. In winter, moose can undergo thermal stress as well. And at this time of year, they have their full winter coat that's adapted to surviving in the boreal forest in the Arctic of the north. And you can see that basically temperatures above freezing, they begin to experience thermal stress. If we think about fall and spring, this is the photo of a moose in late August or early September. And you can see it has its full winter coat. So based on that, you would use the winter upper critical temperatures, but you can see that we're far in exceedance of those temperatures quite often. So the probability of thermal stress at this time is really extreme for moose. So given that overall thermal environment, we wanted to see if there were any microhabitats, like Andy hinted at, where moose could find relief from the heat. So we put up temperature sensors in closely associated stands of hemlock, mature deciduous forest, and regenerating forest. Again, that key foraging habitat for moose, but that is more open. We allowed those sensors to run for the year, and you can see that, not surprisingly, throughout the year, the temperature in those regenerating stands were significantly higher than the other stand types. And that the warmer it got, the greater the temperature difference there was. This means that the warmer it is, the more thermal advantage moose would have by moving from this regenerating stand to a closed canopy forest. So given that, we were collaring moose with satellite tracking collars that got a location on the animals every hour or so. And so this is a portion of data from one of our collared females. All of the yellow locations in the areas outlined in red here are areas that have been logged and the moose is feeding in. The blues, dark blues over here are forested wetlands. Also, I meant to say, so that in the previous slide indicates the benefit of closed canopy forests as thermal shelters. What we believe is one of the best thermal shelters is forested wetlands. And so these provide the benefits of providing shade in a cooler environment, but also shallow water or moist soils that a moose can bed in. And therefore they can remain cool. They can cool from conductive cooling as well. And you see that this moose is moving back and forth between these forested wetlands and the regenerating stands quite often. But are they responding to the thermal environment when doing so? So we can look at the data in a couple of different ways. We can map it by night and day and see if they're altering their habitat use throughout the 24-hour period. Or we can merge that temperature data in from the weather station that I showed you earlier into the GPS location so we know what the overall temperature was whenever they're in any area. And what we see is that the moose responded very strongly to both of these factors. If you look in the upper right, this is the use of regeneration, so areas that have been logged and are growing back as that shrub habitat. Look at the scale here. This is 80% of the time, so roughly 70% of the time at night, this is for the 24-hour periods, they were in those regenerating stands. This demonstrates the importance of that habitat type as foraging habitat for moose. But as we get to dawn, that use decreases by almost 50%, whereas we see a corresponding increase in the use of those forested wetlands, conifer stands, and mixed and deciduous mature stands. We also see these peaks in movement that occur at dawn and dusk, and we interpret this, both the use and these movements, as really a shift in state for moose between foraging habitat at night and using cover and thermal habitat during the day. We can also look at habitat selection based on increasing temperatures. How you interpret these graphs is this line represents the selection for a cover type. For example, this is regenerating forest. And the position of this line relative to the other lines indicates the strength of selection for this cover type. And so we see at low temperatures, the selection for regenerating forest is 3 to 4 times all other cover types, indicating that when conditions are favorable, moose are highly selecting for this key foraging habitat. As temperatures increase, the selection for regenerating forest declines drastically, and use of other types increases. And where they switch is right within those temperatures that are identified was where moose begin to experience thermal stress. So at this point, the selection for forested wetlands, that key thermal shelter, increases and is more than the selection for that feeding habitat. At higher temperatures, now that selection for that number one thermal shelter, forested wetlands, is 3 to 4 times all other cover types. So really indicating that moose are very strongly responding to the thermal environment in Massachusetts. So if temperatures are above those upper critical temperatures, moose have a choice. They can continue to use foraging habitat, or they can use a thermal shelter. There's a cost and a benefit to each. If they use the foraging habitat, they bring in more energy, but it's a more costly thermal environment. Or they can use a thermal shelter and not have to expend as much energy to stay cool, but they can't feed as efficiently, or they miss foraging bouts throughout the day. Regardless of the choice, the result are going to be declines in body condition, lower fat reserves for winter, potentially, if those are severe enough, reductions in their immune system that affect their abilities to fight parasites and disease, and overall reduce their probability of surviving the next winter. Unfortunately, this is all occurring under the threat of increased global warming in the future. Temperatures are predicted in the Northeast to rise by several degrees Celsius per season. We're expected to have longer heat waves, more frequent and more severe droughts, just like we did this past summer. And if you were out in the woods this past summer, you know that many of those forested wetlands and other wetlands were drying up, meaning that the thermal advantage that moose get from bedding in shallow water in those habitats disappears under these scenarios. So the likelihood is that the environment is going to get even more stressful for moose. So what does that mean? Moose populations are declining in several places along their southern range boundary. Does this mean that we should expect a range shift to the north across the range? Well, the ability of moose to adapt to as thermally stressful an environment as Massachusetts is actually gives us some hope that if those key habitats exist, that moose can adapt to a particularly stressful environment, and that likely where we're seeing these declines are not simply climate alone, but climate interacting with other factors as well. For example, in northern New England, it's winter ticks that are devastating the moose population. These are actually photos of moose in Massachusetts. This is a dead calf heavily infested with ticks, and moose get thousands of these ticks on them, and essentially they suck the moose dry in terms of its blood in a very short period. So even healthy moose can be killed by these infestations of ticks at the end of winter. And this is what we're seeing in northern New England at a rampant scale. We're not seeing that in Massachusetts, and it's likely because we have lower moose densities here than they have had in the north that support lower tick densities, and so we haven't seen the impacts. There's other parasites like brainworm, winter fluke that have been contributing to declines in other places. There's also the presence or absence of predators. So in Massachusetts, we don't have, or in New England, we don't have the main predator of moose being wolves. And so that's obviously direct mortality on moose, but it's also huge energy expenditures as these animals are trying to escape predation attempts. Recent studies from Minnesota have actually shown that while early theories were that it was increasing temperatures that was driving the population decline, the time where they were seeing the decline in their population actually corresponded to a sharp increase in the wolf population there. So potentially showing that wolves, as much as other factors, may have been driving that decline. So in reality, whether or not we see a localized extinction or decline somewhere is likely to be a combination of these factors. In Massachusetts, habitat quality is likely to be key. Sustainable logging that creates these early successional foraging habitats for moose is really probably key. So they can use these places that have high forage density to feed when conditions are favorable, but then move to thermal shelters when conditions are unfavorable for them. So sustainable forestry is likely hugely important to the long-term survival of moose here in southern New England. So I'm going to completely change tack here now and talk about the interaction of moose with the developed landscape in Massachusetts and the impacts of the developed landscape on connectivity and habitat protection for moose. So moose were historically in Massachusetts and southern New England and recolonized it. Unfortunately, the landscape that they came back to was greatly altered from the one that they were in before. It's clear to see the impacts of the human landscape if you look at a satellite image and the pure density of development on the landscape. Probably the greatest factor affecting wildlife and the future of wildlife in Massachusetts is the road network. We have an extremely dense road network that has major impacts on landscape connectivity in many wildlife species. One of the most direct forms of impact, obviously, is vehicle collisions. If we look at moose here, we can see that they're wide-ranging species. They're forced to cross roads in Massachusetts, and they are killed when they do so. These are obviously devastating collisions for the moose, but also potentially for the person being impacted. Because of the size and nature of a moose, these can be deadly collisions. One of the ways we tracked actually the growth of the moose population in Massachusetts was through monitoring moose vehicle collisions. And we can see the real growth occurred in the 1990s and early 2000s up to a relative peak in the early 2003-04 time period. More than likely, our moose population has declined since that initial peak. And this is what we would expect to happen in a species that is colonizing unoccupied habitat. It reaches a peak and then settles at a lower level. And this pattern has continued where we're seeing probably 30 or so vehicle collisions per year in the recent past. While it's only 30 to 50 vehicle collisions, this represents a relatively large proportion of our moose population, 3 to 5%. And unfortunately, we had 3 human fatalities resulting from these collisions. At the time, 0.7% of those resulting in human fatality was the highest that was reported anywhere in the literature. And this is likely due to the high density of really high-speed roads we have in Massachusetts compared to other portions of Moose Range. This figure depicts both two things that we were using to model how model moose vehicle collisions and the risk in the state. These yellow locations are all the places where we documented moose vehicle collisions. The blue locations are where our satellite tracked moose crossed and interacted with the road network. And we modeled both of those to try to predict risk. What we see right off the bat is that these vehicle collisions are occurring at hugely disproportionate rates on our state highways and interstate highways. Again, this is due to the extreme high traffic volumes and speed limits that are traveled on these roads that basically they make extremely risky environments if moose attempt to cross them. And they're occurring where these roadways bisect the large intact blocks of forest we have in the state. So we then modeled where the moose vehicle collisions were occurring as well as our moose were crossing the roads. And we took into account the natural landscape, the topography, different forest types and wetlands, as well as the road types and other human landscape features to model both and predict where the vehicle collisions were most likely to occur and where our moose were most likely to cross roads. We combined these two into essentially a risk model that identified the road segments where moose vehicle collisions were most likely to occur. And in reality, these would be the road segments that really have the greatest impact on landscape connectivity for wildlife. Unfortunately, our collared animals also supported the results of this. During the study, we had 25 moose collared with satellite tracking collars, and 4 of those were killed on the state highway network during the study. And this was by far the highest cause of mortality that we had. If you look at the figure on the right, this is a female that's collared adjacent to the Quabbin Reservoir, this area down here, wide ranging, moving all over across the landscape. And she only crosses this state highway about a dozen times throughout the year. But you can see she's killed eventually just after about a year of being collared when crossing the roads. This really demonstrates the huge amount of risk and the impacts to connectivity that these major roads have on the landscape. So moving on from vehicle collisions, we wanted to see if our collared moose were being impacted by the road network in terms of their habitat use and the movements. So each one of these dots is where this female moose was at one period of time or another. And you can see that her use is very clustered. And if you look along the roadways, you can see that there's not a lot of use adjacent to the roadways here. There's kind of a buffer away from the roads, and that the moose is using the interior of forest blocks. We did an analysis to really determine if this was the case, and that it is indeed the case, that moose are avoiding roads, and they avoid major roads more than they do minor local roads or forest roads, which didn't seem to have much impact. And so you can see the effect of this is that, look at this block in the left here, it's a very large block of intact forest, but really because of the impacts of the road network, the actual volume that the area that a moose can use is greatly reduced compared to the overall area. Now, if we look at movements, we can see, if we put the movement path on here, we can see that this female is moving widely across the landscape. She is interacting with roads and crossing roads on a frequent basis. And we wanted to see, were the roads impacting her movements in any way? Are they avoiding crossing roads as they're trying to navigate this landscape? To do this, we compared the actual movements that this is the same animal here, and this red path represents her movement path for a summer season. It's bounded by her home range here, and we now generated simulated movements to compare to her actual movements. And we allowed the simulated movements to move in a buffered home range, this area around the home range. And we did this because if these roads along the edge or this development over here, this major road, are affecting her movements and she's not crossing them, we need to incorporate this buffer in order to take that into account. So we then simulated movements that are based on the actual movements that she made, but on a blank landscape. So this is an example of 10 of those movement paths. Here's 100 of those movement paths that we created for each season. Each one of these yellow dots is where those simulated moose cross the road network. So we then compared where she actually crossed the road network to those simulated movements. And what we see is that indeed moose are avoiding crossing roads compared to the simulated moose. The solid line here represents the road crossing rate of the simulated moose, and the dotted line, the actual moose. Class 2 roads are state highways going all the way down to Class 6 roads, which are forest roads that have essentially no traffic. And so if you look at the Class 6 road, you can see that there's no difference between the real and simulated moose, indicating that traffic has a major, it's not just the road itself, but the traffic and the disturbance level on the road that determines how much moose are going to avoid it. Surprisingly, if we look at these intermediate road types, there's very little difference or no difference in this case between the real and the simulated moose. And this makes you wonder why that might be. If we go back to our animal, these roads that I highlight in blue here, this is a state highway, Route 202, that is adjacent to the Quabbin here. This is one of the hotspots of moose vehicle collisions in the state. Both of these roads are major local roads that receive a lot of traffic. In order for the moose to avoid crossing these roads to the greatest extent possible, but still meet her large habitat requirements, she's essentially forced to cross these local roads. This means that the road density is so high in Massachusetts that they can't help crossing roads that we believe they would otherwise want to avoid. Another way to look at this is by looking at moose use of the overall landscape in Massachusetts. These green areas are areas that were identified by MassWildlife and TNC in Biomap 2 as being critical forest core interiors that were needed for conservation. If we put the moose movement data on here, we can see that this moose is moving around the landscape, but it's really concentrating its use, as I mentioned before, into the interiors of those forest blocks, heavily using these forest cores, supporting the idea that these areas are really essential for the conservation of wildlife in Massachusetts. But we also see that this moose is moving back and forth between these blocks. This is Chalet Wildlife Management Area, if you're familiar with it, Peru Wildlife Management Area, Peru State Forest, October Mountain State Forest, some of the largest blocks of conservation area that we have in the state. But a moose habitat requirements are so large that it has to move back and forth across these roadways. This is Route 9 where it crosses the Berkshires, Route 143, state highways that are bisecting the habitat. This indicates that not only is it important to protect these forest interior blocks, large blocks of intact forest for the wildlife in Massachusetts, it's critically important to maintain the linkages on across these roadways and try to maintain connectivity for wildlife. If we look at this another way, on the right-hand side of this figure, you can see a project by TNC to identify some of these key linkages between these large forest blocks. Each one of these oval polygons are areas that have been identified as key linkages. This is the same area on the right. You can see the similarity between this block and this block here, and the moose is crossing right in this identified key corridor. Same thing happening down here, and if we put on another animal, same thing happening right here. So our moose are demonstrating the importance of these identified key linkages as really critical for maintaining landscape connectivity for large, wide-ranging species like a moose in Massachusetts. I'm going to speak very quickly about the work that we're doing on bears now, and a lot of the similar analyses and similar conservation considerations for bears. At the time we finished the field work for the moose project, we began putting satellite tracking collars on black bears that MassWildlife already had collared with conventional radio collars. MassWildlife was using those to study survival and reproduction, and we put on GPS collars to start getting the habitat use and movement data. These are far, far more fragmented areas. This is the Holyoke Range down into South Hadley and Granby. This is Westover Air Force Base, Mount Toby, and down into the farmlands of Sunderland. So you can see that the bears are using far more fragmented landscapes in some cases than the moose. They still use the large intact forest blocks, but can use the fragmented landscapes. They're far more adaptable at doing so than a moose is. But bears are still heavily reliant on the preserved forest corridors, small blocks of local conservation land, protection of wetlands. These provide key corridors that allow them to move through these more developed landscapes than would a moose. And recently, we've been working on a number of analyses with a postdoc at UMass to look at how different features of the landscape affected bear movements. And we did this by looking at both natural features of the landscape, so topography, forest types, and other features, wetlands, as well as human-associated development, agriculture, different types of development, roads, et cetera, to determine the features that were either facilitating movement or causing resistance to movement for bears. And we can develop a surface for the landscape that allows us to model that, how movements could be allowed across the landscape. We can then do analyses where we calculate how would a bear move, for example, from here to over here while traveling through the portion of the landscape that provided the least resistance to movement. Or you can do what's called circuitscape analysis that does a similar thing. And what this does is this essentially allows us to model what is the current connectivity on the landscape for a species like bear. So these areas that have darker green in these corridors, like here and here, are key places where the modeling suggests that wildlife are moving and are important for maintaining connectivity. And we can use these to prioritize land purchasing and conservation efforts in the state. Similarly to the moose, we did analyses looking at specifically where bears were crossing roads and the different features that were affecting where and how they were crossing the road network. And so whether it's for moose or for bear, I think as Andy said at the beginning, the studies that we've been doing in recent years on the movements and habitat requirements of these animals demonstrates the importance of habitat protection and conservation efforts that are happening both by state agencies like ours, as well as NGOs like TNC and other local conservation organizations. The importance of protecting large blocks of intact habitat for species like moose and other species that need those things, and really maintaining connectivity and protecting those linkages between these blocks to facilitate movements. And this goes for whether it's moose and bear, large wide-ranging species, or species like turtles and our other herps that have major impacts on these populations caused by mortality on the road network. In this way, moose and bear can serve as, and I do want to say, these are pressing issues that our wildlife are experiencing in Massachusetts. Just for example, one of our collared moose in Worcester County a large portion of that animal's home range has been developed in recent years. Just since the study happened, the area where I captured her is now a housing development. There's been so much development that her range has almost been split into two, that if we were to have an animal collared in that area today, I don't think they would be able to use the habitat in anywhere near the same way that she did. But again, if we can conserve enough wildlife, enough landscape area for species like moose and bear, we're likely to be able to protect the entire biodiversity that we have and we want to preserve in Massachusetts. So if you're sitting here today and you're wondering what I can do to help, it's supporting agencies like TNC that are protecting conservation lands and trying to maintain these linkages on the landscape. Supporting MassWildlife in our efforts to maintain the biodiversity in the state, but really contributing. These are pressing issues that are facing our wildlife, and it really will take all of us to conserve and maintain those. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Dave, thank you so much. That was amazing. As you can imagine, the questions are flying in, so take a deep breath, a sip of water, and because I'm not going to give you any rest here. I'm going to start with some of maybe the easier ones, but there's a ton of interest and a ton of questions. So I'm going to jump in with just a little more on habitat use and habitat preferences. So one of the questions is, where do moose sleep and rest when they're not foraging?
Yeah, and so it seems like it is in those, it can either be in a large stand of mature forest or those wetland habitat, forested wetland habitats that I mentioned. They'll go and they'll bed down. And if you're tracking them, you can see kind of where they'll make a wallow down in the mud. So they'll actually get into the mud and make a little bathtub of mud for themselves, and they'll sleep in those areas. Or it can even be in the interiors. Much of the logging that happens in Massachusetts isn't clear cuts. It's shelter cuts, or where they'll leave little patches of trees within the cut, and moose will bed down in those. So it's almost always has some component of cover that they'll stay in.
Great, thank you. And another habitat question real quick. I know you mentioned wetlands, but one question was about water bodies themselves. Do moose use water bodies to relieve thermal stress?
They will, but if we went back to that figure that showed their use throughout 24 hours, I had the forested wetlands and then I had open wetlands. And what you'd see there is that the use of open wetlands actually decreased during the day. So despite being able to go in there and submerge themselves, so those are ponds and lakes and other larger water bodies, because of the impacts of sunlight. So solar radiation, just think about sunbathing or something, your temperature skyrockets. So a moose with a dark coat out in an open wetland during the day can really heat up very quickly despite being in the water. So they do use those, and they also feed on aquatic vegetation in ponds, but it tends actually to be more at night than during the day.
Great, good. And we've got a few questions on the roads and collisions and underpasses, overpasses.
Sure. First
question is, are moose vehicle collisions mostly at night?
Yeah, and this is part of the difficulty with moose, is because that coat is so dark that, and just their height as well. If you're driving along a road and a deer happens to head out, if it looks at you, you're going to see the eye shine in the headlights. With a moose, as you're driving down the road, if it's dark, it's jet black, and your headlights might not pick up the eyes. So a moose could be in the road, and until you're on top of it, you might not see it. So that's why the risk, it is definitely disproportionately at night.
Great. I mean, not great, but
yeah. No, so I mean, yeah. Definitely, if you're driving through some large blocks of forest habitat, slow down at night, because unfortunately, with those long legs, your car tends to go right underneath the animal, take the legs out, and the body mass goes through the windshield, and that's why they can be devastating. So after working on the project, I definitely have knocked a few miles per hour off my my speed limit.
Yeah. So related, would moose or bear use bridges, tunnels, or underpasses or overpasses along highways?
Yeah, they certainly would. And some of our work with DOT has been at how they can increase the permeability or the ability of wildlife to move across the road network. And some of that is trying to determine what, for example, a bear will use in terms of the existing culverts and things that go underneath roads. For a moose, unfortunately, it does have to be either a large overpass where a road goes under, or it would have to be a crossing structure. But from elsewhere, so Utah, for example, just installed a wildlife crossing structure over a highway. And they've documented very quickly in the first year that they've had elk, mountain lion, bears, basically the whole suite of wildlife species that they have in the state utilizing those. In Banff National Park, both overpasses and underpasses specifically constructed for wildlife are utilized by, again, the whole suite of species that they have in those environments. The big issue is that every single one of these, it's cost. Every single one of those structures are multi-million-dollar projects. And with the road network we have in Massachusetts, it's difficult to certainly to fund enough road crossings, but they certainly do facilitate movements across the road.
Great. And just, for the Nature Conservancy has been in discussions with you and your MassWildlife colleagues and MassDOT to see if we can find an opportunity. Protecting land is critical, but making sure it's not fragmented by these roads and that animals can move through the landscape both between and across roads is critical.
Right.
Here's a real simple question, but one I had as well. You mentioned something called a deal period, and we don't know what that is. What is that?
So I didn't even realize it did that. So basically that's essentially the time of day. So it could be nighttime or daytime or different deal periods. So that generally something is nocturnal or diurnal. Nocturnal means they're active at night, diurnal during the day. So it's really the different times of day, or dawn and dusk.
Great, thanks. Here's a really relevant question. Is it legal to hunt moose in New England?
It is in New England. It's not in Massachusetts. There's a law in Massachusetts that says, basically no one shall kill a moose. So our agency does not have the legal authority to open a moose hunt should we believe that it was possible. There is moose hunting in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Maine is still hunting at the same levels that they have in the recent past. Both Vermont and New Hampshire have greatly reduced the number of moose hunting permits that they give out. And they give out they always have given out a limited number of permits per year. But in recent years, with the impacts of winter tick on their population causing the declines, they've drastically decreased the number of permits down to a very low level in those states.
Great. Thanks, Dave. And another kind of simpler question, I think you know this one ballpark. How many moose and black bear reside in Massachusetts in a rough numbers?
Yeah, and so we don't have unfortunately, great numbers on the moose population. It's roughly 800 to 1,000, probably closer to the 800 range, and that's really based on home range size, the amount of the areas of Massachusetts that moose occupy, the amount of forested habitat, et cetera, that we're kind of extrapolating to a number. So it's not a very precise number. For bears, we haven't officially redone our population estimate for a couple of years now, but the last time it was done, it was 4,500 to 5,000 based on the model. And the bear population is growing and expanding its range. So our bear population has been growing. Really, it's done the same thing that moose has, but it's kind of slower in doing so, where it's slowly increasing in size. And as it does so, it's also expanding to the east. So we now have bears that are up against the Boston suburbs. So our population is continuing to grow in recent years.
Right. I know that causes challenges, but I'm still always impressed and amazed that such a densely populated state by people, that we can have such intact landscapes to support those populations.
Yeah, I think people would be blown away if they saw some of the areas in Mass that bears are using. Yeah. And even if you get closer to Boston, really inside of 495, between 495 and 128, there's still a lot of forested habitat. And for a bear, there's a lot of perfect habitat in those areas. So we could easily anticipate bears being right up to the inner Boston suburbs, if you will.
Right. One question related to that is talk about moose territorial habitats. How much overlap and sharing of habitats between individual mooses there.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot. And so moose home range sizes, it's been a little while since I've worked with them really specifically, but I believe we had 88 square kilometers for male home ranges and 60 square kilometers for females as the area they used, but there was considerable overlap. So for example, we were out tracking moose and I saw 6 females together one time in the late fall. I saw times where there were 3, 4, 5 bulls together with some females. So there's a lot of overlap of those ranges.
Great. That's good. I'm scanning. There's a lot of questions. Let's see. I want to keep it moving though. So there were a couple questions on winter ticks, and one of them is related to why are they not happening as much in Massachusetts?
Yeah, and we really think so. Winter ticks are a species that is kind of host specific, meaning that they thrive best on moose. And so what happens is the young ticks will hatch and they'll be in nymph form in the late summer, and they'll climb up the edge of vegetation and they'll be in a little ball of 100 to 200 ticks in this little mass. And as the moose walks through, it essentially picks up all 200 nymph ticks that are the size of a poppy seed all at once. And it'll do this over and over and over again, because basically each one of those clusters is essentially where one female tick laid her eggs. So they can pick up thousands and thousands and thousands of these ticks. They take a meal right then, and then they mature. They stay on the moose and they mature. And it's in winter where they're now adults and they take their large blood meal. And so this is where they swell up to the size of a grape. And they can have thousands of these ticks. So that's where they can remove a huge blood volume in a very short period. Each one of those females then drops off into the leaf litter, and you have more ticks being born. So if you have a lot of moose on the landscape, you can support a lot of ticks. In Massachusetts, we don't have nearly as many moose. In northern New England, there's industrial forest land where there's created a lot of that browsing habitat, so they can support higher densities of moose than we can. And so where you have high densities of moose, you have very high densities of ticks. And so as a moose is wandering through the forest in late summer up there, they're picking up tons and tons and tons of ticks. Whereas in Massachusetts, it's far more likely that a moose can wander through the forest and not go through the places where those ticks dropped off in the spring, and therefore not pick any up. So it's really a reflection of differences in our density, our much lower moose density here than they have in northern New England.
I find that heartening that we can, even though our habitat, we're right at the edge of the range, that there's something special about it compared to further north. So there's a whole big topic around forestry and logging that we're not going to go deep on, because that, as you know, your agency and the Conservancy are steeped in issues of forest management related to carbon and habitat, especially around biomass energy. One of the questions I will need to punt for today is the role of forest harvesting for biomass energy. And that's too deep a subject for today. But I do think forestry is so key to habitat management that I want to make sure. Well, first I'll answer the question. Some of the questions are about the complementarity of older forests and younger forests and forest management. And I will say, as one of the questions, one of the participants today responded, folks like MassWildlife, New England Forestry Foundation have done a lot of research and science about balancing those two. And the Conservancy also feels that there's a need for older forests and younger forests to support a full range of species and the functions: water, clean air, carbon sequestration. But so I'll let you comment on that, on the balance of forestry. But one question in particular was, and maybe just go a little deeper, how does logging provide better habitat for moose? So that was
And so as you were saying, different wildlife species have different habitat features that they need. So some species do require older forests in order to thrive, and they may not do as well in younger forests. Other species need younger forests to survive. It's sustainable forestry, so small scale forestry that happens continuously over time, allows you to maintain all these different age classes of forest on the landscape in kind of a mixed mosaic. In that way, you provide older forest for those species that need it. You provide mid-age forest for those species that need it. You provide young-age forest for those that need it. And the young-age forests become mid-age forest. The mid-age forests become older forest over time. And if you're continually creating small patches of different size, different logging types of forest, you have all these different habitat types. You're not cutting down all the forests and turning it in. So that would be problematic for wildlife if you were to cut down all the forest and just have young forest. Some species wouldn't survive, as kind of happened in the past. But maintaining all these diverse different age classes provides the different habitat components for all the species. When you log an area, essentially you cut all the trees down and it opens it up to sunlight. What grows back are shrubs, saplings, briars that maintain in that age class for 5 to 10, 15 years. And so that's essentially what happens. When you first cut it down, it can look like a desert. They look terrible. It's like there's nothing growing there. But if you go back to that same site in 2 years, people will be astonished at how much regrowth there is, and then how much wildlife you begin to see over the next couple of years that are concentrating for that young forest. And so, as I mentioned really quickly, for a moose, again, because they need to feed in these regenerating stands and they need mature forests and wetlands, they're kind of a species that demonstrates the importance of having both. They're really reliant on the young forest for their feeding habitat. They're reliant on wetland preservation to maintain, the buffers around forested wetlands, so they maintain their microhabitats. Larger mature forest as well for different aspects. So, many wildlife species will use the diversity of these. But if we were to stop logging in moose, we would likely see a decline in our moose population.
Thank you, Dave. That's really helpful. I'm noticing the time, which is sad because I could keep going and I'm sure a lot of folks could, but I know some people need to leave. So what we're going to do is somewhat unprecedented. We're going to keep you on, Dave, for 15 minutes longer for folks to answer additional questions, because we've got quite a few. I think we might be able to put some questions into our response when we send an email out to all folks. But let me just wrap up. First, Dave, where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, so my contact information is available on the MassWildlife website, but my email address is pretty easy. It's dave.wattles, and so you can see how it's spelled in the lower left of my screen. So dave.wattles, all lowercase, at mass.gov, mass.gov. And so that's my email address. If you have any questions or issues related to wildlife, you can definitely get in touch.
Great. Okay, so I'm gonna give folks a few quick reminders, and then anyone who wants, I know a lot of people probably have to leave, but I want to first thank everyone for joining today. It's really great to have you. And thank you for all your support for conservation, for the Nature Conservancy, without which we'd be sunk. We need your support and greatly appreciate it. We will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who participated with links to resources and a recording of today's webinar. And please share these with your friends. And if you want more information, you can look for us on social media, Facebook and Instagram, conserve_MA, to keep up with our work and upcoming virtual events. Quick reminder, next week, the 14th at 12 p.m. as well, so a week from today, we'll be joined by filmmaker and Boston Globe Pulitzer Prize winning environmental reporter David Abel and New England Aquarium's president and CEO, Vicki Spruill. David and Vicki will talk about the making of David's newest award-winning film, Entangled, which chronicles the efforts to protect the critically endangered northern Atlantic right whale from extinction and the impacts of those efforts on the lobster industry and the challenges right whales face in the wild. And David and Vicki will discuss the New England Aquarium's, what they're doing to help protect right whales from extinction and what you can do to help. As always, you can find the past recordings of webinars and upcoming webinars at nature.org/masswebinars. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Dave, for joining us today and for that great presentation. Thanks for joining. And for those who want to stay on, I see there's still quite a few folks on. We're going to continue to move through the questions for the next 15 minutes. So we'll wrap it up then. So thanks, everyone. Take care, have a good afternoon, and we'll see you soon. So let's see. Okay, great. I'm going to keep going with questions, Dave, if you're up for it.
Sure.
Okay. So I'm not as organized as I was at the beginning because there's so many good ones. But do black bears ever predate on moose calves as grizzlies do in the West, in Alaska?
Yep, they certainly can. It's kind of an opportunistic predation. So black bears aren't predators where they're going to be chasing down prey, like, for example, a wolf does, or a mountain lion, where that's their main mean of getting food. But opportunistically, like deer, fawns, moose calves will be there. They'll bed in cover while mom is out foraging, et cetera, and getting food so she can provide milk. And if a bear were to stumble across them when they're very young, they will opportunistically take that meal. It doesn't take very long for a fawn or a moose calf to get strong enough and old enough that they can very quickly outrun a bear. So it's a very short window where that potentially could happen.
Great. Here's a question I know we've discussed. Is MassWildlife posting high impact areas with Mass DOT and the concern? Oh, sorry. Yeah, so a couple questions just on, based on road crossings and highest impact sites, does the state and others at least install road signage indicating high potential impact zones?
Yeah, and so when I was at UMass, we met with some folks from DOT and kind of went out to some of these sites. We looked at these hot spots, Route 202 along the Quabbin, Route 2 through Phillipston out past Westminster, areas where we had really high concentrations of moose vehicle collisions, and other areas, and we installed moose vehicle collision warning signs. Seasonally, DOT will have some of those mobile flashing signs in some of these areas as well, where they indicate that it is the moose rut in the fall. Be careful for moose and other wildlife crossing the roads. So there are some efforts out there. Unfortunately, a lot of the research is that those signs are minimally effective. People see them, and as they get used to them over time, they don't have really the impact necessarily of people slowing down.
Yep, that's great. Okay. You mentioned some of the expansion of the range and the population numbers. Have moose and bear populations reached their carrying capacity in Massachusetts, and have bear population reached its maximum breeding range in the eastern half of the state due to the dense population?
And it's probably a different answer for both species. So for moose, probably yes. And so that's why the population increased very rapidly in the early 2000s and then has declined and stabilized afterwards. Essentially, the population grew to reach the level that it can be supported, and now it's kind of self-regulating, combination of vehicle collision, heat stress, ticks, other mortality factors, brainworm, are essentially controlling the population at this level without continued growth and without something like hunting needed to. In many places, hunting is used as the tool to manage and maintain populations at a certain level, and that hasn't been needed for moose. Our bear population is continuing to grow. And so it is expanding really kind of, if you get out towards Interstate 190, the north-south road that goes north from Worcester, north of Route 2 all the way out to Route 495. That's kind of our eastern edge of our established bear range. To the east of that, we do have bears, but it's predominantly males. Young males disperse widely from their mothers, and so they establish territories in this non-range at this point. Females typically will occupy a portion of their mother's range when they are on their own, and so they're much slower to disperse across the landscape. So every time they hit one of these major highways, it provides a temporary barrier where the population of females doesn't expand much more. Eventually, some do move, and that's when the population begins to grow in that area. So in the east, we hit more and more of these barriers, and it slowed the expansion of bears. But in reality, there's quite a large portion of eastern Mass as well as southeast Mass that is really suitable bear habitat that we anticipate our bear range continuing to expand into.
Great. Well, related to that, we've got one, I don't know if this person is still on, but they live on Cape Ann across the Annisquam River. And do you think bears will ever migrate there?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, again, lots of forest and habitat out there. Rivers are another one of those features that tends to provide a pretty serious barrier for a long time. Very few of our bears cross any major rivers. For example, we've had a lot of bears collared adjacent to the Connecticut River over the years. I think we've had one female cross the river briefly once and then go back. But it's pretty much a hard barrier for them. And so that was, our population has grown from a remnant population in the Berkshires. It spread throughout Western Massachusetts, eventually stalled at the Connecticut River. Eventually they crossed the Connecticut River and spread. So they may reach the river up there. It could take a while then for them to make the jump across, but it certainly is possible. It just may take a long time.
Great. Isn't there a famous story of a bear that showed up on Cape Cod, which means it swam the Cape Cod Canal?
Yep. And so that was before I was in the biologist, but was involved at UMass. And that's one of those younger males that is dispersing and in that non-range, if you will. And they tend to move really widely. And, for whatever reason, that one wandered all the way through Southeast Mass and then all the way got across the canal and out to all the way out to Provincetown.
Impressive. I know this might be unknown, but do you have any sense of how many moose and bear are east of Worcester in the eastern half of the state?
So for moose, it's very few. If there are any there, there probably aren't any moose there, or very, very, very few. For bears, it's extremely low density at this point, except for that northern tier of the state. North of Route 2, there aren't any of those major barriers until you hit 495 and Route 3. So our range kind of extends further to the east, north of Route 2, than it does in that southern portion. And so we have moderate bear densities all the way out to towns like Chelmsford, Groton, in that area. But we're getting now increasing numbers, Concord, in places like that. There are now resident bears. Again, low densities, but it will be increasing in recent years or in coming years.
Interesting. So the concept of nuisance bears being desensitized to humans and houses, are they also desensitized to roads and cars? And are they therefore more likely to have road collisions?
Yep. And so this is obviously an enormous component of my current job, is trying to prevent this from happening. In reality, a bear is a species that is driven by food. Because they hibernate in the winter, they have to gain all their fat reserves throughout the few months they're active. So they're going to take advantage of any food source that they can. Nuisance bears tend to be bears that are just taking advantage of the foods we provide around our homes. Bird feeders being the biggest one, garbage. But if we as communities and individuals continue to provide these foods, it essentially trains bears that the best place to find a reliable meal is around our homes. The more time they spend there, the more comfortable they get there, and the more time the less responsive they'll be. So I often get calls of, there's a bear in the backyard of my bird feeder. I yelled at it and it just looked at me. And eventually it sauntered off, but it wasn't in any hurry to do so. And that's just a bear that spent a lot of its time, probably raised from a cub, spending time in backyards. We do have an indication from our college studies that bears, for example, in the Connecticut River Valley, where it's highly developed, high road density, a lot are involved in vehicle collisions. Many of our bears are killed on Interstate 91 trying to cross and navigate that road in that area.
A related question to desensitizing and being accustomed to humans. It was a longer question and it was really well worded, but I'm going to paraphrase it for the interest of time. One of the participants noticed the increase in fisher sightings and wildlife cameras and bobcats, as well as bears. Are these wildlife populations becoming adapted to human development and human conditions?
You've got a couple factors. It's the same factor that happened to moose that I talked about in the talk. where they were historically found throughout Massachusetts. The population was locally extirpated, or in the case of other species like bear, decreased to very low densities, habitat loss, et cetera. And then different species have had different rates of recolonization and expanding back to their historic range. But basically, as the forest grew back in Massachusetts, many of the forest-dependent species have come back as well. So bear, moose, fisher, like all these species that have essentially naturally recolonized the state and are then expanding. But we have seen in recent years, for example, that fisher and bobcat populations in the sighting rate calculations that we do are starting to be highest. Well, fisher more so, because bobcat is another one that's slow like bears to expand its range. But fisher in eastern Mass, we get our highest sighting rates from hunters in the Boston suburbs. And I speculate this is because they find very good hunting ground at bird feeders. The prey of fisher is squirrels and chipmunks and birds. And basically, those are attracted by bird feeders to people's backyards. And so that provides ripe hunting opportunity for species like fisher. Fisher, interestingly, are species that we long thought needed large intact blocks of forest in order to survive. And yet they're really thriving in these suburban and urban even environments. But the story of the recovery of many of these wildlife species is kind of the same. They were reduced, and then it's the slow, gradual reestablishment of the population. And again, it takes different times based on the reproductive rates, the dispersal rates of different species.
Right. And speaking of attracting to bird feeders, we do have a question, and I know this is a tough one. Should people avoid bird feeders because of all these issues related to wildlife?
Yeah, I mean, and I know not everyone wants to hear this, but if I could do one thing and snap my fingers, there'd be no bird feeders in Massachusetts. Really, bird feeders and other human associated foods are the drivers of human wildlife conflict. And so it really, there's no question that it leads to the death of wildlife. And it's a major issue for us. So yeah, if I had my druthers, it certainly would be don't put out bird feeders.
Thanks. I guess it wasn't that tough a question for you.
No, when you do what I do, it's definitely not a tough one.
More black and white.
I guess I should also note there is that the birds don't need it. You know, it's like we right. People, I understand too that people love to see the birds. I don't want to be dismissive of that. But if you're going to do that, simply be cognizant of the fact that they're not bird feeders, they're wildlife feeders, and that there are consequences for wildlife, including the birds, that you're attracting to them.
Right. And people, there's a lot of more options to plant native species that birds are attracted to too, right, that produce berries and fruits that they can use through the winter. Back to habitat, do moose use beaver impacted wetlands for feeding or refugia?
Yes. So beaver wetlands create a suite of habitat types for different wildlife species. Beaver essentially will use different portions of wetlands for different times. And then as the food around that portion of the wetland, they use it up because they eat trees and saplings. So it's a limited resource. They'll abandon it and they'll go occupy a different portion of wetland. Eventually that abandoned area it's either a pond that decreases in depth, it grows back in shrubs or a grassy area because of the rich mud in the bottom. And so it creates a real diversity of different habitat types. So for a moose, they can use the shrub and the sapling that grow in those areas for food. There's aquatic vegetation that they can feed on in there. And then again, just the benefits of the various types of moist soil, shallow water, et cetera. So there's a strong association for beaver wetlands.
Great, Dave. We are out of our extended time now. There are still some questions. I'll work with the team to see if we can weave some of those answers into our email that's sent to everybody. Dave, I want to just thank you again. Any last words you want to share with the folks still on?
Yeah, I guess, as I said at the end, we all have a role to play in conserving the wildlife that we all enjoy here in Massachusetts. I don't think you'd be on this presentation if you didn't care about the wildlife and the conservation of our wildlife. Certainly Andy and I have a role in the work we do to try to protect and conserve wildlife, but individuals do as well in terms of the choices you make at home. But also, you can contribute to agencies like TNC and directly contribute to the protection of habitat. And these efforts will help to maintain habitat, the suitable habitat for our species, as well as maintain the landscape connectivity that species like moose and bear rely on. So you do have a role to play, and I'm sure TNC would appreciate any contributions that you can make, and the wildlife will as well.
Thank you, Dave. Great afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please join us next week, Right Whales and the film Entangled. Please join us for future webinars. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all your support, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.